And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on YouTube and iTunes and Stitcher and Pacifica Radio Network and Progressive Radio Network and SoundCloud and lots more. And the archives of the show are available at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. And my guest for this show is Thom Hartmann. Thom is a dear friend. It's going on almost 30 years that we've known each other. I can't believe it.
Yeah. Half our lives.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. And Thom's a progressive national and internationally recognized syndicated talk show host. Talkers Magazine named him America's most important progressive host and has named his show one of the top 10 talk radio shows in the country every year for over a decade. He's a four-time recipient of the Project Censored Award. He's also a New York Times best-selling author of 26 books translated into multiple languages. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg for Thom. Thom is a true Renaissance man who just is an encyclopedia of knowledge about so many things. It's amazing. I know another new project you have, you've got a science show that you're doing now too?
Yeah, we call it the Science Revolution, and it's a once a week podcast, basically. We tried doing a video for a while, but it was kind of beyond the bandwidth of our video producer. So we're just doing it as audio right now. So we're on, Apple Podcast and wherever you get podcasts.
Cool. So it's been a long time since you've been on the show. And so I just want to catch up with a lot. I think you and I were among the earliest to start talking about the need to get rid of billionaires, to make it so that there were no billionaires. We both started talking about it about 7, 8, 9 years ago. And now everybody's talked about it. But back then, there were just a small handful of people who were willing to be described as crazy enough to propose that idea. And what inspired me to invite you back on the show is you did an article that really wasn't exactly about billionaires, although it was in the title. And the title was, where's the title here? How Billionaires' Short-Term Greed Could Upend America and Destroy Their Own Wealth. That was the title, but it really was something else. Describe what this article was about.
The article was about how the federal government, outside of its functions, of the military and Social Security and some, basic stuff, the federal government has principally become a source of reallocation of money, principally financial assets, from blue states to red states. You've got blue states that get back sometimes 60, 70 cents for every dollar they send to DC. And you've got red states like Kentucky, I believe, gets back like $4 for every dollar that they send to DC. So the blue states have been massively subsidizing the red states for the better part of 50 years, probably longer than that, but as far back as I could find numbers for. And at the same time, these red states, their representatives in Congress, are blocking any forward progress on things that the blue states want. The blue states want healthcare for everybody. The blue states want free college education for everybody. The blue states want higher standards for pollution and environmental sustainability. I mean, there's just a whole long list that you might call a progressive list, but I'd say it's really kind of a mainstream, maybe Democratic list when you do your polling on the people. And so what I proposed is that we eliminate the federal income tax and go back to the system that we had prior to really the 1960s, 1970s, which was that the federal government is funded by tariffs and fees. 100%, every single dollar that the federal government spent from the administration of George Washington through the administration of Woodrow Wilson, every penny came from tariffs. During the Wilson, or maybe it was just before that, 1913, I don't know what year, who was president that year, but in 1913, we got a federal income tax, and that started adding to the tariff revenue. And so World War I, during and after World War I, about 2/3 of our total revenue came from tariffs. And then after World War II, about 1/3 of our total revenue, because the income tax went up to 91% during World War II, and stayed there. I mean, through the Eisenhower and Kennedy and administrations, Johnson. And so we got about a third of our revenue from tariffs. And then, when Reagan started his free trade mania and started radically cutting tariffs, and then Clinton signed on to the deals that Reagan had negotiated, the GATT and the NAFTA, the WTO, PNTR for China, all that kind of stuff. Our tariffs went to on average 1 to 2% out of, from an average 20 to 30%. And so that manufacturing could move offshore. And our tariff revenue collapsed. And then, a whole series of tax cuts on rich people, starting with Reagan, meant that taxes on the middle class increased, federal taxes increased substantially. And so now, in corporations, corporate income tax was a third of federal revenues in the 1950s, and now it's 6%. So I'm just saying, do away with the federal income tax altogether. Let the federal government fund itself with tariffs, and shut down all those socialist programs that the federal government does that the conservatives hate. Leave Social Security intact because it's already there, and Medicare, it's already there. But beyond that, food stamps, housing support, college tuition, Pell Grants, all those things, just do away with all of them. Give the red states exactly what they want. And then let the blue states raise their income taxes up to 30, 40, 50, even 7. I mean, the income tax was at 74% when Ronald Reagan came into office, and the country was doing just fine, thank you very much. Shift that to becoming a state income tax rather than federal, and let the blue states form compacts, like we just saw this week here on the West Coast. California, Nevada, Colorado, Washington State, and Oregon all got together to collectively buy PPE and test kits and deal with the coronavirus, and collectively to decide, how to shut down the states, how to reopen the states, all that kind of stuff. So we're operating as a group. You've got the states in the east, you've got the states on the west, or the northeast and the west, and then you've got a few states in between, like Colorado and potentially Michigan, potentially Wisconsin, that are moving back toward blue.
And Illinois and Minnesota.
Yeah. And basically just create a compact of all those states, where those states then just all throw into one giant pot and collectively administer their own Medicare for All program, their own free state college education program, their own housing support program, their own food support programs, and let the red states do whatever the hell they want.
Well, now, what about government and military? Who's going to pay for those things? How's that going to get?
We've always been successful in paying for our military out of tariffs, and if we go back to a 20 or 30% tariff on imported goods, we could easily cover the federal budget for the military.
Now, that would probably make both Democrats and Republicans' heads explode, because they all love globalization. How would they ever get past that concept?
Well, you've got the Trump Republicans who hate globalization, and that's a large and growing faction inside the Republican Party. He's got 95% approval among Republican voters. Keep in mind. And that's probably, that and his racism, his immigrant stuff. Those are the two main issues that brought those people to him. But historically, that was a Democratic position. And I mean, Bill Clinton stabbed the Democratic Party in the back when he signed NAFTA and became a neoliberal free trader.
That's item one on about 50 different ways that he did that, of course.
Yeah, but it's one of the worst. But you still have, Sherrod Brown, who's no raging left winger. He's a good progressive senator, but he's viewed as mainstream. He's been beating this drum for years. He's been on my show dozens of times talking about how we need to bring back tariffs. And of course, Bernie is all over that. Elizabeth Warren is all over that. You've got, I think easily the majority of the Democratic Party would be in favor of that. And frankly, it's going to be the thing, I think, it's going to be the main thing that will save the Democratic Party. Clinton, I think, lost the Midwest to the extent that she did, in part because she was supporting neoliberal free trade. And it's one of the things that scares the hell out of me about the Joe Biden candidacy. Unless he makes a U-turn on trade, I think that it's going to be a real tough November.
I think Joe needs to make a couple U-turns and maybe
give him a list.
Maybe get off the road altogether. But yeah,
we'll see. I can't control that.
What I love about it is this is like a fishing line that the Republicans could bite on, And they might go for it because it like you said, it does what they've been saying they want. In your article, you talk about how the billionaires have been calling for all of this as well.
Right.
And it could, what justice, what irony that would produce. It'd be amazing, really.
Well, plus a lot of these billionaires live in blue states and they pay virtually nothing in income taxes because, you know, the federal income tax on billionaires is down to 15% now. You only have to pay pass-through income if you're a billionaire. And so they pay lower income taxes, billionaires do in the blue states. They're paying lower income taxes than people, literally people working at McDonald's. And so if we flip to a state income tax, they wouldn't be able to avoid that. And billionaires would have to start paying their friggin' taxes.
Well, you know, now I've been advocating for the de-billionairization of the planet.
Yeah, as you know, I have the website, nobillionaires.com.
I know, yeah, I love that. And how would a estate tax, I mean, I've always thought that the way to do it would be, one way would be with taxes, but it doesn't have to be, of course. You know, I've broken it down. I think the easiest way to start getting rid of billionaires is to make it illegal to create a billionaire through death. We need to have a dynasty tax or a dynasty law that prevents billionaires from handing over billions to their progeny. Mm-hmm. I think that's the simplest, you know. Of course,
you know, let's go back to Teddy Roosevelt's state tax.
Yeah, and of course, you know, Trump and McConnell just made it the worst it's ever been in a really long time. So we'd have to really do something about that. But then it's, what do you do with new people?
States could establish their own estate taxes too.
Yeah.
So, you know, all the billionaires will end up moving to Mississippi. Good riddance.
Yeah, right. Yeah, let them enjoy the local entertainment and culture down there.
Right.
Yeah, I understand there's a lot of white robes that are entertaining down there.
Yes.
But I mean, I want to see this happen. And you know, most, you know, when I tell this to conservatives, they think I'm totally crazy. They say you're jealous. They say that people need to make of billionaires.
Oh, yeah.
That people need to have a motivation. And I say, you know, I don't have a problem with people becoming millionaires. I don't have a problem with people making $50 or $100 million. But when you hit $1 billion, I think people become dangerous.
It's a toxic extraction of resources from an economy. And you have to ask the question, you know, why do we have economies? Why did we get together and create government in a way that provides or defines the rules of the game of business, the rules of the game of economy? Did we do that so that all of us working people could become the vassals of the billionaire class, of the people who own and run the economy? Are we here to serve the economy? Or is the economy here to serve us? And I would argue that if you go back, you know, from reading Adam Smith to Thomas Jefferson to even John Adams, you know, the founders, there were no billionaires among the founders. In fact, there were no millionaires among the founders. John Hancock was the wealthiest man to sign the Declaration of Independence, and his wealth, he was worth about $700,000. He was wealthy, upper middle class. You know, this whole thing, this oligarchy that has emerged with the billionaire class is destructive to democracy. It's destructive to the economy, and it's certainly destructive to having a healthy middle class.
I think it's inhuman. You know, I've interviewed anthropologists and I've asked them, what would people in indigenous cultures do? You know, I got started with my interest in indigenous cultures with Wolf. What's his name?
Richard Wolf. Yeah.
Not Richard. No.
Robert Wolf. Yeah.
Robert Wolf. Robert Wolf, who studied an indigenous tribe in Asia.
Malaysia.
Yeah. In Malaysia, they disappeared. He told me that they disappeared decades after he studied them. They were wiped out by logging.
Yeah, it was the Sonoy.
The Sonoy, yes. But that got me started on a journey of learning a lot about indigenous people, learning about Native American culture. And, you know, if you ask anthropologists or indigenous people, what would they do if somebody tried to keep half of the tribe's or the band's wealth? There's three answers. One, treat them like they're insane. Two, ban them, shun them, or three, and actually the guy who told me this one was at the time the president of the Society for the Study of Psychopathy. They would, in the case of northern indigenous people, you've been up there, where the Inuits are, they would put them on an iceberg, which basically means kill them.
Whoa. I didn't know about that, but you know, I mean, we kept this under control in the United States with a 91% income tax. That is the reason why in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, the average CEO only took 30 times as much pay as a janitor. Because hey, after you get at 31 times the janitor's pay, your income tax is starting to cross the 50% threshold on its way to 91% or 71% after, I think it was 67 that LBJ dropped it to 74%. But even at 74%. The other thing you find if you look around the world is that those countries that have an income tax higher than 50%, and we're talking top marginal rate here, we're not talking the average Joe, but those countries whose income taxes top out over 50% tend to have very, very stable economies, very robust middle classes, and tend to weather recessions and depressions much more easily than those countries that have income taxes that are below 50%. And it's because they've evened out the inequality somewhat. You know, nobody's calling for a Marxist state here, you know, where nobody owns anything and everything is administered by the
right.
This is a flywheel. This is a protective system to protect us from greed. You know, Rob, if you know, we watch these shows like Hoarders on TV, and you see, you know, people whose their living room is filled with newspapers, floor to ceiling, and their kitchen was filled with empty tin cans, and we look at them and then we think, oh, those poor people. They've got, you know, they're mentally ill. They've got a obsessive compulsive disorder that's turned into hoarding syndrome, and that's so sad. Well, you know, I would argue that the Koch brothers and Bezos and so many of these other guys who are so very, very, very rich, if they were born poor, or they didn't have some entree into the world of business, or they frankly just didn't have the business smarts, they would be those people with the newspapers floor to ceiling. I think that, you know, you look at the difference between those folks and people like Thom Steyer, who made $1 billion and then said, okay, enough. And I'm going to spend a good chunk of this $1 billion trying to make the world a better place. And he went seriously into philanthropic efforts. You know, that's a whole different thing. And, you know, Mike Bloomberg kind of had a come to Jesus toward the end of his life. You know, I mean, he's an old man now, but he's still around. Although I don't know if that was more like Rockefeller's, you know, or Carnegie's endowing things to have their name live on. But in any case, billionaires are toxic. It's a toxic presence in society.
I think they're incredibly dangerous. And, you know, people just don't need to have a $200 million house or a $150 million painting. They just don't need those things.
Well, those things are available to multimillionaires. You don't need to be a billionaire to have those things. Yeah. And you know, it's just a straightforward thing that there are limited resources. You say, well, there's an unlimited potential or an unlimited amount of cash, but no, there are limited resources in many ways. And it's just, the other thing is, if you look at the research that Kate Pickett and Richard, who wrote The Spirit Level and Why Inequality Matters, these two authors, those two books are two of the most brilliant books I think I've ever read in my life. And if you haven't read them, let me strongly recommend them to you. And
Spirit Level, and what's the other one?
Why Inequality Matters. And they've got a new one out. It's the something level. It's another level word, and it's also about inequality. They've got a foundation. They're British. They got a foundation in the UK, and they've got all this research on their websites. And they do a country by country analysis around the world. And what they find is that country by country by country, as inequality goes up, so too goes up mental illness, suicide, homicide, crime of all kinds, child abuse, drug abuse, school failures and dropouts. I mean, you know, name your social ill. They go up as inequality goes up. And those same social ills, and some of them you would think are like hardwired, like mental illness, those same social ills go down as inequality goes down. And then they did the same analysis state by state of the United States, and they found the exact same thing. The states that have the highest inequality have the highest levels of mental illness, the highest rates of suicide, the highest homicide rates, et cetera. And the states that have the lowest inequality ratios, the Gini coefficient, have the lowest levels of these social ills. So
okay, we need to take a quick break, 20-second pause, so I can throw in a bumper for the radio show, and then we'll talk about why that makes a difference. And my guest for the show is Thom Hartmann. He's a progressive national and internationally syndicated talk show host, ranked among the top 10 in the country every year by Talkers Magazine. He's a 4-time recipient of the Project Censors Award. What's the best place for people to get in touch with you? ThomHartmann.com?
Yeah, that's our website. Yeah. By the way, Richard, the guy who was the co-author with Kate Pickett of these books on inequalities, last name is Wilkerson, Richard Wilkerson.
Wilkers, great. So they found that the higher the inequality, the more problems with mental health, all kinds of problems. Why is that?
Because we're social animals. I remember a study that was done back in the 70s, and I've searched the internet. Now, this, of course, was 20 years before there was an internet, but I've searched the internet for this, and I have not been able to find it. And if you ever come across it, let me know. But I remember very, very clearly, and I've referred to it many times in my life, in the 1970s, when Louise and I were first married, we were living in East Lansing, Michigan, and we used to listen to NPR in the mornings. And NPR did this show about this researcher who was working, as I recall, in Michigan, either at University of Michigan or MSU. And what they found was that all the squirrels' nests over the years tend to slightly vary in size within about a 10% range. And so the original research was to find out if this was a way of predicting how hard the winter was going to be. And there was actually a correlation between that. The squirrels were somehow able to sense how bad the coming winter would be. But so what they did was they took, and these were, as I recall, gray squirrels living around the university. What they did is squirrels build nests out of leaves, and they're pretty big affairs. They're like the size of an eagle's nest in some cases. And so what the researchers did is they went out and they added leaves to these squirrels' nests to increase their size by 20%, but not all of them, just some of them. And then, sit back and watch what happens. And what they found happened was over the course of the next 6-8 months, into the next year, all the squirrels that didn't have the extra 20% went out and got enough leaves to have that 20%. As mammals, we take our cues from other members of our species. As to what we should have, how we should live, how we should conduct ourselves. And it's a biological imperative. It's a survival thing. And so when people see great wealth and they don't, or even moderate wealth, and they have access to none of it, it is psychologically, emotionally destructive. There was a big change, and I believe that Wilkerson and Pickett talk about this in one of their books. It might have been another source, but you and I are old enough to remember the Jackie Gleason show in the 50s and 60s, and the old Lucy show. Jackie Gleason lived in a 3rd or 4th floor walk-up cold water apartment in New York City. His best friend Art Carney he was a bus driver. Jackie Gleason was in this, his character. Art Carney worked in the sewers, had a good union job working in the sewers. But they lived a very, very middle-class life. Lucille Ball, her and her husband lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York. We had, Dick Van Dyke, the Dick Van Dyke Show. They lived in a suburban, single-level ranch home in New Rochelle, Connecticut. That was, so, the middle class was watching itself on TV. Then came the Reagan Revolution, and within a year or so of Reagan getting elected, suddenly the houses on TV and the stars on TV started getting bigger and wealthier. And you had Dynasty and all these shows about very rich people, and rich lifestyles of the rich and famous came out. And ever since then, basically the homes that we see on TV are no longer the Beaver Cleaver homes or the Dick Van Dyke homes. Now they're homes that would be worthy of a wealthy squire, and you have to ask yourself, what does this do to people who are living, who are just getting by, who are living in a one-bedroom apartment, who are living in a trailer, and perhaps more importantly, what does it do to their children who think, oh, that's how you're supposed to live, but mom and dad can't do this for me?
Why did the networks do that, though?
They were just following the national zeitgeist. Before Reagan, you remember Jimmy Carter walked to his inaugural from the Capitol building to the White House? He walked to the White House for the inaugural balls. He didn't want to ride in a limousine because it was too hoity-toity. The inaugural balls for Jimmy Carter were low-dollar events, and the money went to charity. Reagan came in. He rides in a limousine to the White House. He throws his balls. It costs thousands of dollars to get a ticket. You had to wear a black tie and cowboy boots was the recommended thing. I mean, Reagan shifted the entire country. We left behind in 1981. We left behind Keynesian economics. We left behind the New Deal. We left behind the idea that unions are good for us all, that we're all in this together. The middle class is the core and backbone of America. We left all that behind. And we bought into this new bullshit lie of Reagan and his billionaire buddies that the real core, the real backbone of America was the really, really powerful and wealthy people in the United States. And we've been in that bubble for 40 years now. And frankly, I think that the Trump depression that is starting to kick off now and is going to get really, really bad over the next year or two, is going to cause us to recalibrate, much like the Great Depression in the 1930s did. And if a good Democrat gets elected and we have good guidance of that Democrat as president, that we might see America return to its core values, return to the values of the New Deal and the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society.
You think Larry Summers could be part of that?
No.
Yeah, that's where Joe Biden's going, though.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, Franklin Roosevelt, when he campaigned for the White House in 1932, his principal campaign pitch was that he was going to balance the federal budget. It's not exactly what he did. There's a mysterious power to events, to paraphrase Roosevelt. And I think that if a Democrat gets into the White House, even if he or she is not inclined to consider themselves a progressive, events are going to propel them inexorably in that direction. And
so we should talk about your new book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, because there's a big question about whether the votes will be counted and whether the Republicans will be successful in blocking enough votes to keep Trump in office. So talk a little bit about your new book.
Yeah, well, it starts with the founding of the Republic and comes up to today and talks about all the ways that the vote has been suppressed by, first by, whites in the South, and then, first by, wealthy Federalists who didn't even want people who didn't pay taxes to vote. And then, the literacy tests and all this kind of stuff that happened in the South post-Reconstruction. And to the modern day Republican Party starting in the 1980s with Reagan. And basically the only way that they've been able to hold power is through voter suppression, is through, preventing people from voting, or vote theft, I would call it. Somebody steals my car, they didn't suppress my car, they friggin' stole my car. And so I think that's a real important message. And, I've got, chapter and verse on the whole thing. But I would add to that Trump is collapsing right now in the polls because of his failure to deal with the coronavirus and 60,000 dead Americans and probably 100,000 because it looks like we're undercounting them.
I think it's going to be 100,000 by the end of May.
Oh, I agree. Officially, yeah. And I think we're going to have 250,000 by the election officially. But the thing that really concerns me about this, Rob, is the election of 1876, the Tilden Hayes election. In 1876, this was the first major election after the failure of Reconstruction, or actually before the failure of Reconstruction. This is what led to the failure of Reconstruction. At that point in time, the Union Army had troops in the southern states. The southern states were just finishing the process. In fact, by 1876, all of them had finished the process of rewriting their constitutions to strip slavery out of their constitutions and guarantee the right of former slaves, of African Americans, to vote and participate in society. And in that election, Hayes was the Republican and Samuel Tilden was the Democrat. And Rutherford Hayes lost the election. Tilden got a majority of the electoral votes and a majority of the popular vote, and nobody disputed that. But the problem is that in order to win the Electoral College, which is how you actually become president, you have to have a majority of 50% plus one of the votes. And the problem was that in 3 southern states, as I recall, it was Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, but I could be wrong. I wrote an op-ed about this. You can find all the details in there. 3 southern states and Oregon. And Oregon at the time was occupied not by the Union Army, but by the Klan. In those 4 states, the governors of those states were unable to certify the election results. In fact, you had the Democrats in those 4 states saying that Tilden won, and you had the Republicans saying that Hayes won. So there was a dispute about who won in each of those 4 states. And those 4 states constituted enough electoral votes that even though Tilden won the majority of the electoral votes, he was 1 vote short of winning the Electoral College, of being that 50% plus 1. And so the 12th Amendment to the Constitution says that when that happens, the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives, and in the House of Representatives, the vote will be determined. Each state gets 1 vote, and that state's 1 vote is defined by the combined legislature of the state. So, for example, Wisconsin has a Democratic governor. Let's say you had a state. I don't know which states have Democratic. Have a split to House and Senate.
Legislature of the U.S. Congress or the states?
The state. So you're in Pennsylvania. Do the Republicans control both the House and Senate?
I know they control the House.
Well, let's say that the Democrats control the Senate, just for purposes of discussion, and you've got a Democratic governor. But the governor has no say in this under the 12th Amendment. The vote is of the combined body of the House and Senate. So you've got a small Senate and a large House. The House is controlled by the Republicans. Even if the Senate is controlled by the Democrats, the absolute numeric majority of elected officials in Pennsylvania are almost certainly Republicans. So they would collectively vote for the Republican, and they would instruct their House delegation to cast their vote for, in this case, it would have been Hayes, or today it would be Trump. And we've got 32 or 34 states that are overtly controlled by Republicans, and almost 40 states where a majority of the total number of legislators are Republicans. So Trump would win the vote under the 12th Amendment if Trump comes out, or if the Republicans come out after the vote is held in November, when it comes time to certify the vote, and you get a couple of big states, like say Texas, where it's illegal to get an absentee ballot if you're not disabled, and and a couple of other states, and just the governors or the state legislatures refuse to certify the vote because they say, people were afraid to vote, they didn't show up, or we think there was voter fraud with the absentee ballots, or whatever BS excuse they come up with. If they can come up with an excuse not to certify their vote, if they can suppress the Electoral College vote to be 1 vote below that 50 vote, or that 50% majority, the election gets thrown to the House, where each state has 1 vote, and you would have probably nearly 40 votes for Trump, and only 10 or 15 votes for Biden, or 15 or 20 or 25 votes for Biden. And I'm doing my math poorly.
No, 15 or 20. Yeah. And they're saying that this is what Justin Amish could produce if he gets in and actually.
Well, he probably wouldn't produce this because he's not going to have any impact on the electoral vote. broadly. But yes, you're right. Part of the plan to elect Joe Biden or whoever the Democrat is, Biden still doesn't have enough, what do you call it, delegates to have locked up the Democratic nomination. And New York just called off their primary.
Yeah.
So
What do you think of that?
if a couple of other large Democratic states call off their primaries, then Biden could go into the convention without having the number of delegates he needs to lock it up, at which point, if he doesn't win on the first ballot, it's wide open and anybody can nominate anybody. And out of that might come, for example, an Elizabeth Warren presidency or even a Bernie Sanders presidency or candidacy. And I think that we need to keep our eye on that. It's unlikely, but it's still in the realm of possibility. But the thing that really freaks me out is that the Republicans, from what I'm understanding and hearing, are actually planning on this strategy of trying to corrupt the electoral vote this fall to the point that they can use the 12th Amendment to throw it into the House.
Yeah, that's why you told the story about Tilden and Hayes.
Yes.
So
because that's what happened, by the way. Hayes, the Republican who lost both the popular vote and the electoral vote, cut a deal with the southern states and said, I'll end Reconstruction and withdraw the Union Army if you will go with me. And so the House of Representatives gave the election to the Republican because he cut that deal. And that's how Reconstruction died.
So so Trump and the Republicans would make some deals with some states.
They wouldn't have to make any deals with anybody because they have enough states have Republican controlled legislatures or Republican majority legislatures, combined House and Senates, that he's
and
got.
so they just wouldn't certify the electoral votes then? Is that all it takes?
That's correct. That's correct.
So it's really not hard to do.
That's right. And in fact, there was a law passed that really fine tunes this, and it's referenced in the article that I wrote, the op-ed that I wrote, that forget what it's called, but it was passed in 1877 or 79 as a result of the Tilden Hayes election. That makes it even a little crisper, a little easier for Trump to win in the fall.
And so, the swing states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan.
It won't matter. None of that will matter. If it gets thrown to the House, it
will matter because Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they're controlled by Republican legislatures. So they can do that then. Even if Biden or whoever the Democrat is takes the election and wins the electoral votes, they could neutralize them. Wow. All right, so we've got a little bit more time. Well, we've got about 20 more minutes, and I want to do a brief show ID, and then we'll come back, and I want to get personal with you.
Sure.
So, 20 seconds. And my guest for the show is Thom Hartmann, the amazing, incredible Thom Hartmann, who I love. And Thom is the host of the Thom Hartmann program, and he's also the host of I didn't write it down, I guess. Science Revolution. It's a Science Revolution podcast, a relatively new project for Thom. Thom's written dozens of books published in many languages. He is a true Renaissance thinker. And Thom, you're also a kind of a spiritual guy too. And I really wanted to spend some time talking to you about where you are with that part of yourself, and how how you're being affected by coronavirus. I call it Sea World, and how what you're learning from it, practices that you're engaging in that you'll keep doing, that you were inspired by.
Well, I haven't really changed very much as a result of sheltering in place. I'm a big fan of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said that when you say your prayers, go in your closet and close the door, and when you give alms, when you help people, do it in secret. So I tend not to talk about the things that I'm doing, but I'll just say I find a lot of solace and comfort in prayer. I find the most important prayers for me are ones that revolve around the words thank you, and um, and in meditation, regular meditation, and in connecting with nature, I see God in the natural world. I'm probably more like a Thomas Jefferson deist in that regard.
That's Native American too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Yeah.
animals. Yeah.
So how do you connect with nature?
I look out the window and go, wow. I mean, you know, I take Louise and I. We live along the Columbia River, and so we go for long walks along the river. You know, we're very fortunate to be able to do that. But anywhere you go, anywhere you live, there's something green growing. There's something that's alive. It's actually alive, and it has its own form of consciousness. You know, I believe that if you could, if you could, well, one of the things that we know from Albert Einstein is that matter is nothing more than slowed down energy. And the amount of energy that got slowed down to make a particular thing, say this pen, if you were to take all that matter and disassemble it and release the energy from it, the amount of energy that would be produced by disassembling this pen and reducing every atom back into energy would be equal to the mass of the pen times a very specific number, which is the speed of light squared. E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And so if we were to, if we could put on a pair of glasses and see just energy, because all matter is made up of energy that's slowed down. Matter is like ice cubes floating in water. It's the same stuff. And if we could put on a pair of glasses and see just energy, we'd see this whole graduated spectrum of energy going from really coarse forms of energy, like the sound waves coming out of my, you know, coming out of your speaker right now. You know, light waves that your eyes are seeing, the photons. Well, it's both waves and particles, photons and waves. You know, through the electromagnetic spectrum and all this other stuff you see, and until you get down to the most subtle energy at the bottom level, there's an energy that every other form of energy is made out of, and then every other form of energy or every form of matter is made out of all those forms of energy. So at that bottom level, if you could put a pair of glasses on and see that most subtle energy, I believe you would see a couple of things. One, that the entire universe is actually solid, that that's all that there is. It takes different forms like ice cubes in water, but that's literally all that there is, number one. And number two, that energy is a form of consciousness. And I think that as we touch that energy, we describe that consciousness as love or as bliss. You know, the Hindus call it Sat Chit Ananda. And that, you know, many of our practices are to retune the frequency receiver of our brain to try to tap into that energy or its echoes, you know, the less subtle forms of it. And I think that at the beginning of our universe, that energy was everything and everywhere, and it became self-aware. It kind of blinked and boom, the universe popped into being. And so wherever I go, whatever I'm looking at, whatever I'm doing, even if it's entirely man-made, like the camera that I'm looking at right now, I, deep down inside, I know that is made out of God too. You know, that everything, or what you would call God, you know, the primordial source, that it's all the same stuff. And I find that it appeals to the science part of me, but I find it just vastly reassuring. And you know, it explains continuity of consciousness. It explains lots of paranormal phenomena. It explains, frankly, love. I think it explains so much.
I think that what you're describing is that we're all connected to everything, and everything is connected to everything else. And, you know, I think it's the ultimate bottom-up way that the universe functions.
Yes, well said. Apropos of your book.
Yes, bottom-up revolution. And, you know, so do you meditate in a way that reflects that awareness and that thinking?
Yeah, I have since I was a teenager.
How do you meditate?
Well, lately I've been meditating using the Muse. It's a little headband that is an EEG, a neurofeedback device. And it's my favorite toy right now.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, you don't know about the Muse?
Well,
MUSE?
you know, I kind of, is that David Seaver's?
No, it's out of a couple of people in Toronto. You got to get one, Rob. They're like, they're a couple $100, and it's you remember the Siegfried and
Awesome.
Susan, yeah, the Othmers. They had that incredibly cool machine where you had two PCs. One drove the electrodes, and the other drove the screen and everything. And they were selling it for like 20 grand. I mean, I bought one back in the 80s, and I had it at my house in Atlanta. And they had a protocol in there, an alpha theta protocol that was just, it would put me to sleep and give me wild dreams. And they had some, alpha beta protocols that were just so cool. This thing does what that did. And it does it with this little tiny headband that just goes over your ears and connects to your iPhone by Bluetooth.
And after all these years, you're finding that, I mean, look, you attended, I think, 13 of the 15 winter brain neurofeedback conferences that I ran. I mean,
Yeah, I
spoke at all, but the first one, when I didn't realize what an amazing speaker you were, and you came just to attend. But I have an intimate relationship with neurofeedback, EEG, brainwave biofeedback.
I think you might be the guy who turned me on to it.
Yeah, well, no, Siegfried brought you to the meeting.
Oh, he did? Okay.
Yeah, Siegfried brought you to the Siegfried Othmer, and they've got a new model now that's very different. You might want to get in touch with them and find out
I
what.
did. I contacted them a year or so ago and tried to get one, and it had to be through a dealer and this and that. And
Yeah,
we never could make it happen. And that's when I discovered the Muse, and I was like, holy cow! And this Muse thing is so sophisticated now. They've got a new one that it has a heartbeat monitor. You can meditate to your heartbeat. So it's like biofeedback as well as neurofeedback. You can add that to the EEG stuff. It's a very sophisticated EEG detection system. It's got a motion detector in it, so it tells you if you're starting to fidget. I mean, it's just incredible, Rob. You're gonna love this.
That sounds cool. Do you? And that's it. That's what you're doing now. I mean, do you have meditation practices that other listeners could use without having the technology?
I used transcendental meditation and Kriya Yoga, self-realization fellowships, meditation techniques for years and years and years. And I still recommend TM to anybody who wants to check it out. And SRF still offers it's a 1-year course to work your way up to Kriya Yoga. It's a breathing exercise. But you start out with simple meditation, and they guide you through a whole series of them. And I'm sure that there's a million, YouTubes out there on how to meditate.
Well, I'll tell you, I love what you just described as your picture of the universe, because that's how I meditate. I literally say to myself, trying to shift from inward and focused on me to being connected to everything. I repeat to myself a kind of a mantra: I, you, we, all one. And what I try to do is open myself up to remembering that I'm connected to everything. And
I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah. Go.
Okay. That's what I love about Vipassana, about mindfulness meditation, which is another form of meditation that I used to do as practice, but now I just, catch myself constantly doing in the normal course of my life, which is, you just pause for a moment and notice where you are, notice how you feel, notice the feelings in your body, notice what you're hearing, notice what you're seeing, notice what you're tasting and smelling, and just cycle through your senses a few times, and then just rest into it and just be present with everything that is. And you just sit there with your eyes open in a comfortable position, without looking around, just looking at one little spot on the floor kind of thing, and just be present with everything. And don't judge it. And whenever a thought comes up, just say to yourself, thinking, and like touch it like a soap bubble and watch it pop in your mind. And that's one of my favorite forms of meditation. It's kind of a variation on what I learned at Karma Choling at Tail of the Tiger, the meditation retreat up in Vermont that I used to go to back in the late 70s and the early and throughout the 80s. Been a long time since I did that. But, that I did Buddhist meditation. We actually joined a sitting group, a Zen sitting group here in Portland for a while, but the group kind of fell apart. So. And plus, now we're locked in the house, so all of our practice is private.
Except you're going out for walks.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, and I've started doing that too. You know, I'm usually a gym guy. I go to the gym, I play racquetball 5-6 times a week for an hour and a half to 3 hours, and it's a great workout. I'm exhausted and totally sweaty when I'm done, and I can't do that anymore. So I've discovered there's an incredible park system here in Philadelphia, and I've been exploring it, walking along the sides of creeks, and it's been wonderful, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's been a gift of SeaWorld, really. And really the idea of having the time to sit and take a moment and just to be aware, like the Vipassana that you just was.
Well, and that's the one of the things that I discovered. I bought an iWatch, an Apple Watch, a year or so ago, because I found that I was spending enormous amounts of time staring at my phone. It's like this little dopamine rush, and I was constantly checking my email and looking at the news sites and checking the weather and seeing, looking at Facebook or whatever. I mean, just it's like there's constantly something to entertain you, and if all that fails, you can play backgammon and against the computer. And I realized I'm getting addicted to this thing, and so I got the watch so that I could take phone calls and I could get text messages, and in an emergency, I could send or receive an email. And it kind of broke my screen addiction, which was pretty liberating. I hadn't realized how badly how much of a screen addict I'd become.
Well, how did it break your screen addiction? Explain that.
I no longer carry my phone.
You don't. You just leave it around the house.
Yeah,
You still need the phone to connect to the watch, right?
No, you don't. No, I mean, it's an extra, I think, $100 to get the watch that has connects to your cell phone company, and the cell phone company charges an extra $5 a month because it requires actually a second phone number, although that's invisible to anybody trying to call you. So when somebody calls me, my phone rings and my watch rings wherever my watch is. So I've traveled without my phone. Although generally I do carry my phone to travel. But the last couple of years, when I used to go to work in the radio studio, I never took my phone with me. I just take my watch, just wear my watch.
So you really intentionally dumbed down your phone.
I had to. It was starting to get me.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of that out there.
Yeah.
A real lot of it out there. I mean, and my understanding is that screen addiction leads to all kinds of addiction.
Well, and it also leads to depression and anxiety.
Yeah, but I mean, this starts with little kids. I mean, and it's unavoidable, and it's really hard not to use. I mean, so many parents use television or iPads or phones to entertain their kids, to babysit them.
Right.
And it's bad news.
I think we were very fortunate, Louise and I. Our first child was born in '73, and our three kids, our youngest is now 36. After our children were born, we got rid of the television, and we had no television until the last child left the house, which I think was in the early 2000s, like 2003. And no, it was 2001. It was right after 9/11. Kareth left home, and we got a TV. And so our kids grew up without cell phones and without television. And they're all avid readers. They're all super smart. They're all, I think they're much emotionally and psychologically much healthier as a result of those decisions.
Yeah. And it's so much harder now for parents, harder now than ever, I think, to keep the screens from the kids.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to create something pretty hard. I think it's terrifying, really. I think the possibilities, the addiction, the depression, it's going to be bad.
Yeah, and now that you've got predators stalking the internet, with everything from pornography to scams and targeting children, it's become a very dangerous world. And the FCC's eliminating net neutrality and abdicating, this idea of common carrier, which makes it even more of a Wild West. Now it's a corporate controlled Wild West. It's just not a good time.
So I want to go back to the question, how do you see coronavirus changing us in a way that'll last after it's over?
I think it's woken this generation up to what security means. Prior to prior to 2019, we thought that security meant having a strong military. And our military not only has not helped us, our military has been crippled itself by this virus. And so I think that, one of the things, I think the main lesson is going to be that security comes out of society. Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society, it's only a collection of individuals. She was wrong. Reagan, endorsed that idea. That's at the core of neoliberalism and Reaganism.
And libertarianism.
Libertarianism, yeah.
And narcissism.
Yeah, and other forms of psychopathy. And I think that, we're rejecting that wholesale now. And that's a really, really good and healthy thing.
Well, that would be a good thing. So basically what you're saying is that what will come out of it is the realization that we're all in this together and that we can't depend on any powerful individuals to do this.
Yeah, the billionaires aren't going to save us. And there is a reason to have a government.
There is a good reason to have a government. So we got to wrap. Any last words you want to add?
I'm so pleased to be on your show with you, Rob. We've been friends for decades, and we're not in touch enough. I'm so pleased that you were able to get that book out, your bottom-up book, and that you're doing this show. And I'm grateful to you for having me on. Thank you.
No, it's been a pleasure, and it's always great to talk to you. Jeez. My guest for the show has been Thom Hartmann.
Thank you, Rob.
An incredible progressive talk show host, talk program host, author of dozens of books, Renaissance man, and a dear friend. Thanks so much, Thom.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a pleasure and an honor.